I'm Mary Kubica, and this is the story behind my story.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thorpe,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanders,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Mary Kubica.
Thanks for tuning in to Author Stories. It's September. That means it's a new month full of brand new author interviews. We have got a loaded schedule for this month. I'm really excited for you to hear some of the shows that we have lined up for you with some tremendous authors telling stories about storytelling and the creative process. Find all of the archives of the show over at hankgarner.com. There are links in the right-hand sidebar where you can subscribe to the show on any platform that you listen to podcasts on. hankgarner.com, where you can listen on the site or subscribe everywhere. Today's show is brought to you by Grammarly, an intelligent writing app. Download Grammarly's browser extension and create a free Grammarly account at www.getgrammarly.com/Hank. That's www.getgrammarly.com/Hank. Grammarly is an excellent tool that will help you get your document that you're working on in shape before sending it off to your editor for that final pass. If you need that first look, Grammarly is the place to go. Also, for all of your correspondence on the web, Grammarly can help you make sure that you're saying what you intend to say. Get Grammarly.com/Hank. Also, thanks to my buddy C. Stephen Manley for sponsoring the show. His book, Master of Hounds, The Pickman Files Book 1, is one of my favorite urban fantasy books that have come out this year. Chuck has been on the show before. He's one of the hosts of Keystroke Medium, one of my favorite group of guys, and one of my favorite podcasts out there. Master of Hounds, The Pickman Files Book 1. Clint Mercer is about to get a crash course in magic. I love this book. I know you will too. Pick up Master of Hounds today. There's a link to it in the show notes. We'll talk more about it as the month goes on. Now on to our author interview for today. Stay tuned after the show for an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Mary Kubica on the show with me today. She has a fantastic new book called When the Lights Go Out, and it is on sale today everywhere that you buy books. Welcome to the show, Mary.
Thank you so much for having me here, Hank.
I'm excited to have you. We begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
That's a great question. I remember pretty clearly I was actually at a sleepover at my grandparents' house with a cousin of mine, and I was probably maybe 8 or 9 years old at the time. And I had always loved to read up until that point, but I had never really thought about the author sitting at home writing these stories that I loved to read so much. It was sort of as if they just began at the bookstore, at the library, the moment that I laid eyes on them. And then I was at the sleepover, and my cousin shared with me a story that she had written. And I had this whole new outlook on books and writing all of a sudden, that people actually wrote these stories I love to read so much. And I was inspired, and I think in that moment, I excused myself, grabbed a pencil and some paper, and I started writing right away, and I haven't stopped since.
Oh, that's so cool. I've met a lot of people that had a similar awakening like that, where you suddenly realize that people write books, and then when you actually meet a person that you know in the flesh and blood that wrote a story, that's like, the world changes in that moment, doesn't it?
Oh, it absolutely does. And even as an author myself, I'm still completely starstruck when I meet the authors that write the books that I love to read. And I just love talking to authors and getting to know more about their process. And it's just such an amazing thing.
Oh, me too. That's the entire reason I do this podcast, is because I just love to hear how people got to where they are and what it is that makes them tick. And the creative process, fascinates me because it's like magic that we get to, dip our feet in every day.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. So what kinds of books did you love to read when you were younger?
I read really a little bit of everything, but a couple that stand out are both by the same author, Natalie Babbitt, Tuck Everlasting and The Eyes of the Amaryllis. And those were just my all-time favorites. When I was a younger girl, I read them over and over again. As my taste changed a little bit as I got older. In college, I majored in American literature, so I read a lot of the classics. And I read pretty much everything now, but it's no secret that suspense and thrillers are really my go-to when I'm looking for a good book to read.
Yeah. I'm a big suspense and thriller fan as well, and I have a lot of thriller writers on the show. I guess just because I kind of gravitate toward those books a lot. But what is it about that genre that really intrigues you?
Yeah, I just love a book that really grabs my attention. That there's this mystery I'm just dying to solve, and those twists and those turns, and when I come to an ending that I totally didn't see coming, it just fascinates me. As a mystery writer myself, and then I think just as a curious person in general, I go into every suspense or thriller that I'm reading looking for that twist. So I certainly don't always think of them, and so I just love it when an author can really surprise me.
Oh, I do too. I think that's what I love about them as well, is just the, there's so many unknown things about the world and life. And, when we kind of get put in the position where we can, sometimes it feels like we help solve the mystery by reading along, or we get so invested in the characters that, with so many things that you can't have any control over in the world, being a part of the solving the mystery, I think is kind of a thrill ride for readers.
Yes, I completely agree. And I just love the ability to lose myself in a book. Just to be able to sort of tune out the rest of the world and just get totally lost in this wonderful book that I'm reading. So that applies to really all genres.
Yeah. So let's go back to when you were younger for a minute. You went to college and you studied literature. And what did you anticipate doing with your life at that point?
I studied history and literature, and I wanted to be a teacher, which I did go on to be before my writing career sort of took off. I was a high school history teacher for a number of years. So even though I was writing from a pretty early age, I never actually thought to myself that I wanted to be an author one day. For me, it was a hobby. It was something I was totally passionate about and loved to do. But it was something I was very private about as well. It's the kind of thing I did after school behind closed doors, and I was reluctant to share my writing with family, friends, teachers. So I kept that part of my life to myself, really. But I always knew that I wanted to be a teacher. So I went that route and taught for a number of years, both in the Chicago public school system and then out in the Omaha public school system. And it wasn't until I left my teaching career to start my family that I started writing in earnest and thought seriously about trying to get something published.
Nice. Do you feel like teaching helped you as a writer, communicating with people? I don't know what it might be, but do you feel like that teaching had any impact on your creative process?
I think it did. I think writing psychological suspense, I'm always trying to get inside my characters' heads and just people's heads in general and really see what motivates them, what makes them tick, where their weaknesses are, all those types of things. And so I do believe that working in the schools and working with kids and just getting to know them and, find out more about their lives and their families and the different ordeals that they're going through personally too, I think that helped me. Just learning more about human nature in general, I think, had a huge impact on my writing.
Yeah. People say that to be a writer, you really need to develop two skills pretty well, and that's reading a lot and just writing a lot, just getting in the trenches and just doing it over and over again until you get better and eventually good. But I like to add a third to that, and I think you need to be around other people. You need to observe the human condition. You need to listen to the way people talk. You need to look at the quirky things people do and the secrets that they hide and all of that stuff. And I would think teaching would be a great place to observe people.
Absolutely. I mean, I just, in a school building, you encounter hundreds of people a day. And so there's just such a wide array of human beings that you're encountering, and so much, not necessarily material for writing, but just so much to learn from that process. And you're right, listening to people. I know that is so important when writing dialogue. And it's one thing that often I'll do when I'm writing dialogue. I'll actually read it aloud to myself after I've written it, because you want that dialogue to sound natural and like something that people would really say and not something contrived. And, my characters, I want them to be authentic. I want them to feel very multidimensional to my readers. And so, again, I agree wholeheartedly with you that reading, writing, and just paying attention to people, the environment. I'm always observing, when I'm at the grocery store or the post office, I'm always eavesdropping on conversations and just watching people go by. And I feel like that all adds to, just my collection of experiences that I can use in my writing.
You said that you stopped teaching to start your family, and that's when you started to seriously consider writing again. You mentioned that it was really something that you kept private. How did you go about getting started, and did you have an idea, or did you just have the idea to have an idea? You know what I mean? Like there's a thing I want to do, and I'm just going to start it and see what comes.
And it was pretty much like that.
I say that from experience. I know exactly what that feeling is. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that many authors are the same. I think you don't know that it's all going to come together until it does come together. Right. But I had many starts and stops over the years. Many ideas I was really enthusiastic about, but I would get partway into a manuscript and just lose interest in it. I wasn't sure where to go with it, and so I'd set it aside and dive into something new. But it was just in the months after my daughter was born. She was an infant, sleeping, thankfully, a lot of the time still. But I had the idea for The Good Girl, my debut novel. And when I first started it, it was just like any of those other manuscripts that I had started and stopped in the years prior. And I had no idea if I would ever finish it. I wasn't even thinking, of next steps. If I did finish it, what would become of it? But I just loved to write, and I was really excited about this story. I think I fell in love with it in a way that I hadn't anything I had previously written. It was the first book or manuscript that I had ever worked on that I would classify as psychological suspense. Before that, my manuscripts really lacked that mystery element. So, and that too, it was one of those things I didn't intend to write a psychological suspense. I actually set out to write a bit of a love story, and then these dark twists and turns sort of naturally worked their way in, and I knew then that was sort of what I was supposed to be writing. I found my niche. So I worked on it when my daughter was napping, or if she went to bed, or if she was just content. I'd get on the laptop and write a little bit here and there, and it took a while to finish the book. It took about 5 years. I have a son who's just 2 years younger than my daughter, so soon I had two at home, and finding time to write got more and more difficult. But it took about 5 years to write, and when I was done, I had to do something with it, or at least I had to try to do something with it, and just see if this manuscript could become more than just another file on my computer.
So how did you go about doing that?
Yeah, so I didn't know anybody in the publishing industry at that point in my life. I didn't have any author friends. I didn't belong to a writer's group. So I was brand new to this. And thankfully, I was able to find some wonderful information on the internet, and it directed me to a book called The Writer's Marketplace, or The Writer's Market. And I should say at this point in time, I had written The Good Girl completely in secrecy. So only my husband even knew it existed. But I was too I had a lack of self-confidence and didn't really want to share it with him quite yet, because I wasn't sure if it was good or not. And So I wrote up a query letter, and I just sent it far and wide to every agent that I could find that I thought, represented what I thought this book was. And every single agent that I sent it to actually ended up turning that manuscript down. And I was sad, of course. I really felt that I had given this manuscript 110%. But on the other hand, I think that it was sort of the expected response. And I moved on. I started working on some other manuscripts. And 2 years after every single agent had rejected it, one of these agents reached back out to me. And as it so happened, she had been working as an assistant for another agent when she first read The Good Girl. She was brand new to the agency, and she came across it in the slush pile and brought it home to read and fell in love with the manuscript, but just couldn't get the rest of her team on board. Well, as luck would have it, within those 2 years, she was promoted to a literary agent, no longer working as someone's assistant. And she remembered the book and was still so passionate about it and reached back out to me. So it's a dream come true story. And I tell aspiring authors all the time that it really only takes one person to, make your wish a reality.
Isn't that crazy that there, when the planets align, when that one little lucky circumstance happens, and the likelihood that anyone will ever read your story just comes, it all lines up, and you're just like, oh my goodness, what do I do now? Up until this point, nobody knew I was doing this, and now everyone's going to know that. How do you deal with that kind of sudden realization that the thing you've been doing in secret, now you kind of have to own up to it?
Right. Oh, and that it was an event, really, because I wrote the book for 5 years and then took 2 years to find an agent. So this was a secret that I had kept for 7 years from everybody but my husband. And, my parents, most people that knew me didn't even know I liked to write. My parents had assumed it was something I outgrew during my childhood. So not only do I have to admit that I'm publishing a book, but, this is still something that I'm so excited and passionate about that I love to write. So, I remember calling my parents first and having a very long phone call, and everybody has been so supportive. But, I think it took my mom in particular quite a while to process it, like days to process it, to really wrap her head around it. And so it was exciting. It was really, I loved being able to share that part of myself with everybody, to not have to keep it a secret anymore. I was glad that I did keep it a secret, because it took a huge amount of pressure off when I was going through that querying process and receiving all those rejections, right. Because I think it would have been so much harder if other people were, had their hopes out for me too, that this would all work out. So this way I would be the only one disappointed if it didn't happen. So that made it a bit easier. But most people, the first thing that they asked when I said that I would be publishing a book, asked if it was a children's book. So they were quite surprised when they read The Good Girl.
They're like, oh, she's got this in her. Okay. Well, we're all happy that you're on this side of publishing where you are now instead of the other side where you were. But there's something special about that time when it's just you and the book, you and your husband, you and your wife, whoever is your supportive person at the time, and it's just you and the book. And because you can never get that back, because then once the book is out there, then you have to write another book, and the expectations are very different after the book is published, aren't they?
They are. I love to write. That will always be there for me. As soon as I finish one manuscript and I think to myself, I'm going to take a little break, it's not 2 weeks before I'm opening up a brand new Word document, because I'm just so eager to get back into it and start a new story and create new characters. But you're absolutely right that things have changed entirely since the days that I wrote The Good Girl. The process has changed. Now I have to get a proposal approved first and things like that. And of course, there is a deadline, which I tend to be a fast writer anyways, but I think just having a deadline looming puts more pressure on it. And, then I'm thinking word counts and things like that to keep myself writing all the time. So it changes things. I love my career. I wouldn't trade it in for anything, but there are days that I think it would be nice to go back to, the experience I had when writing as a good girl. And, when it was just me and that manuscript. A lot of times people will ask me what my favorite book is, and I usually say it's The Good Girl. And it isn't anything about the novel itself, but just the whole experience and just all of my hopes and dreams that were kind of hinging on this one manuscript, and just not knowing what was going to become of it. But it's been a wonderful ride.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of following up books and then, writing proposals and getting the next project going, I hate when people ask writers, where do your ideas come from? Because ideas are all around you if you just pay attention. There are ideas everywhere. But the real challenge is deciding which idea is a good idea and which idea will carry a novel. How do you kind of sort through current events and, things you see on the news or conversations with people or, just observations in the world? How does that one, thing pop up above the rest and you think, okay, this is going to be the next story?
Yeah, that's such a good question. It's almost a gut feeling, I would say. There's just that aha moment where I feel like you just know. And I wish that I could put it in better words, but I think this in particular pops out with my fourth novel, Every Last Lie, which came out last year. And I got the idea for that one. It was a newspaper headline that I had read about how a young girl's nightmares helped solve the mystery of her father's death. And as soon as I saw that headline, I just knew, without a shred of doubt, that there was a story there, not necessarily the story that was in the article attached, but my own story. And I had to go with that one. So I feel like you just feel it in your heart and soul that there is more to it, that I can actually get a novel out of this. That said, I have jumped into a manuscript thinking I had this wonderful idea, only to get partway in and things sort of fizzle out, and I start to realize, it's not as promising as I thought it was going to be, or there's not enough to it to actually create a full-length novel. So there are moments where I've been wrong about it, and had to set a manuscript aside and start over. And I think that it's just sort of a learning experience, and anything that doesn't actually make it to a finished book, I store in a drawer and, can go back to it if I need some ideas on characterization or just, some of the smaller details that happen in those pages that can be reused later on.
Yeah. The reuse is crucial, because I've had stories like that and they just don't go anywhere and you really thought they would. But you put it in a drawer and sometimes you get to kind of rob them for parts, and, this character would be great in this story or this situation or just this quirky thing this character does. So the trick is to not get so frustrated with it you completely abandon it, but save it and know that there might be something good that comes out of it anyway.
Right. Absolutely. I feel like there's so much useful material there, even if it, doesn't make it to the manuscript that you think it's going to make it to, you can go back and use that information again. Absolutely.
Your books are psychological suspense or psychological thrillers. What makes a book venture into the psychological territory?
I think for me, it's really just the way that I try to get deep into my characters' psyches and really bring them to life through these mysteries. So I think, even though I might have there's a, perhaps a murder or a kidnapping, or there's some elements of that mystery going on there, I think the psychological aspect is that I dive a little bit deeper into it and, look at the grief or the feelings of wanting or abandonment, or those issues that really sort of make my characters tick a little bit more. And so I think it goes a notch beyond just solving this crime and sort of not a who done it, but more of like a why done it and a how done it, and sort of taking it up a notch. That's sort of how I like to classify them. My characters are very, very important to me. I really try to make them, I said this earlier, but just as human as I possibly can, as authentic. And I want my readers to really, they don't have to like my characters. They're not going to like many of my characters, and they're going to hate the decisions some of my characters make. But I want them to find them relatable or just realistic on some level.
Right. Let's talk about your new book, When the Lights Go Out. Jessie Sloane is the protagonist in this book. Who is Jessie, and what brings her to this story?
Sure. Jessie is a 20-year-old woman whose mother has just died from cancer. And Jessie has spent the last 5 years of her life caring for her mother, and she's set her whole life on hold to do so. There's no father in the picture, no extended family to speak of, so it's just Jessie and her mother. And after her mother dies, Jessie, decides it's time to make a life for herself, and she heads off to find a new place to live and apply to college. And in doing so, she comes across some startling information that makes her wonder if she's really the person she thinks she is. And of course, with her mother now gone, there's nobody to talk to about this. So she sort of sets off on this journey of self-discovery. But I couldn't just let her off the hook so easily. So I actually thought I would complicate this for Jessie a little bit, and on top of everything else that's going on, her grief and that type of thing, Jessie is unable to sleep. Since her mother's died, she's not able to sleep at all. And as the days and days go on without sleep, she becomes really disoriented. The fatigue sort of gets the best of her to the point that she starts experiencing paranoia and hallucinating, and so it really complicates everything else that she's going through.
So you really get deep into the psychological aspects of this story, because Jessie is literally her mind is playing tricks on her, or is it? And that by taking advantage of that kind of plot device, you are able to really ratchet up the tension, because I think it's something that all of us deal with at one point or another in our lives. This fear of the dark, this fear of what happens when I go to sleep, or when I can't go to sleep, or what's going on out there. Right. I think that resonates on a visceral level with almost everybody.
It does. And it was so interesting, as soon as I, months ago, started to share the concept of the book, publicly, and people heard that there was the insomnia aspect to it. So many readers were intrigued right away, because, as you said, we've all suffered from at least the occasional sleepless night. And I think that there's kind of two parts to it. Number one, there's the nighttime hours where you just lie there unable to sleep, and the night goes on so long when you can't sleep. And of course, your mind just loves to play games with you in the middle of the night and, think of all these things you'd rather not be thinking of. And so Jessie goes through a lot of that in the novel too. But then, of course, subsequently during the day, we're tired, we're grumpy, we're clumsy. There are so many physical symptoms that accompany that fatigue as well. And, as the days go on, of course, that's only going to worsen.
Right. Our youngest daughter, was diagnosed with relentless seizures, when she was little. And that means you have seizures in your sleep. And she was never able to really settle down and get into good sleep. So she was just sleep deprived constantly. And she started doing horribly in school, and just all of these weird things. She would forget the names of things around my wife would give her a stack of clothes and say, put these in the dresser. And she'd have no idea what the dresser was. It was just like, we had all these, concerns about what was going on with her. And, when they finally did the test and realized what was going on and got her on medication, she completely changed, like overnight. You would be amazed what a good night's sleep, or what a bad night's sleep, or months on end of bad night's sleep, would just wreck your brain, your personality. It was so many things connected to that.
Oh gosh, I can imagine what a difficult experience that must have been for all of you to go through.
It was crazy.
Yeah.
But like we say, I think everyone can relate to that. So you've got this awesome thing going on in this book, and I know what you say about when you tell people kind of the setup for the book, because I kind of got chills, goosebumps on my arms when you started talking about it, because like, oh, this is going to be amazing. But you've you also have this this other great device you're using in this book with this dual timeline. There's also something that happened 20 years ago. What is going on there, and how did that come into the book?
Yeah, absolutely. So then we have the story of Eden, which, as you said, is 20 years prior to Jessie's story. And Eden's storyline is set in Door County, Wisconsin, which is a wonderful place that I have vacationed many times, just a short drive from Chicago. So, which is why I decided to set there. I just love the area. But in Eden's storyline, she's a young married woman, and she and her husband, happily married, they decide to start a family. And things don't go as planned, and they end up struggling with infertility, which just wreaks havoc on their marriage, their finances. And little by little, Eden grows more and more desperate to have a family, to have a child. And, so we see how far one woman will go to have a family of her own.
Wow. This is your fifth book? Is that right?
This is, yes.
Does the writing process get easier as you go, or, with each book, are you sitting there at the computer with a blank slate and it's just kind of, it's all magic all over again? Each book is its own thing, really. I have to say, it doesn't necessarily get easier or harder. It's just each book. I would say for some reason I can't quite pinpoint, this was a more difficult one for me to write. I felt like I knew my characters quite well. Sometimes I feel like it depends on how well I know my characters and how easy it is to get into their heads and tell their stories. That makes a big impact on the writing experience. But each book just sort of becomes its own thing. I can't, and I like I said, I can't put my finger on what it is. And for some reason, it seems to be an every other type thing for me. One book goes a little bit easier, and then the next one gives me more grief. Well, the good news, book number 6 is going to be a breeze.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. The more challenging ones, though, I think also turn out to be the more rewarding ones, because I know that I have put that extra effort into it, and it's taken a little bit more out of me to make it work. So I think that there's a greater sense of pride when it's all done.
Yeah, for sure. Your publisher's Harlequin, isn't it?
Yes.
Harlequin has really revamped and changed over I don't know how long, the last few years for sure. I remember as a kid seeing my grandmother and her sister would get these Harlequin paperbacks and read them in trade books when they were done. And those books were very particular books. I don't mean to disparage anyone or any company, but they put out a very particular kind of book, and I think everybody knows what I'm talking about. And but Harlequin is doing some very different things now, and lots of great suspense books and thrillers coming out of there. How are they as a publisher to work with?
I love working with Harlequin. I have nothing to compare it to. So, I've been with Harlequin from day one, but I've been so pleased. I love the team that I have, my editor, my publicist, the marketing and sales teams. I feel like it's a very close-knit group. I've, of course, had the pleasure to meet a number of people at different events, Book Expo and different conferences. And I've been to the offices in New York and met the Toronto team. And so it's been wonderful. I feel the same as you, though. When I first came on board with Harlequin, when my agent had sent me a list of all the different publishers she wanted to submit my first novel to, and I saw Harlequin on there, and I thought, well, I don't know that I would classify this as a romance. And it took me by surprise a little bit, because at that time I was sort of the same mindset that they were a publisher of romance novels. And as I started to get into it and do my research and learn more about Harlequin and meet so many different Harlequin authors, they've got everything, nonfiction, teen fiction, and it's just amazing. And it's, growing and growing. I'm part of the Park Row imprint now, and there's just some wonderful literature coming out of Park Row. And it's just been a thrill to be a part of this whole experience and working with such great people.
Never judge a book by its publisher.
So true.
Especially when you haven't given enough thought and research to know what the publisher's doing. That's
Absolutely.
Yeah. So the same here. We have made great friends in the publicity department and how we got connected with you, and they're just doing such awesome things. So I love working with them, and I love all the stuff coming out of there now. It's just really, really great stuff.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah. Mary, are you how much work goes into a book before you start writing it? How much pre-writing? I know that you said that you do a proposal for the book, and I know how that goes. Sometimes you put a proposal together, and the end book that comes out may or may not fit that proposal. But
right.
how much planning and plotting and all of that good stuff goes into your books before you start writing?
Yeah, I'm not a plotter. So besides the proposal, which I would say is maybe 3 pages maximum, I think it through, but I don't really put any additional information on paper during that planning process. So usually I'll submit a proposal to my editor. For the first few books, I would actually give her a couple chapters too, just so she could get a feel for the characters' voices and that type of thing. And then we'll usually have a conversation on the phone and just talk it through. If she has any concerns, we can address those at that point. But then I'm off and running, and I just, dive right into the writing process. So I don't always know my twists up front. A lot of readers will ask that. I did with When the Lights Go Out. That was actually the first idea I had for the book, was the twist itself, and then sort of created the story around it. But with my previous novels, I did not know the twist until I was partway through the writing process. So I usually start my first chapter, and I'll just sort of introduce the problem as I like to think of it, and then sort of get to know my characters. And from there, once I have a better grip on who my characters are, I can start to formulate some more ideas and see where this story is going to go.
I think a lot of writers are that way. We generally have an idea of where it's going and maybe a beginning, but the fun part is going between those two and figuring out how you're going to get these people to that ending or to the twist or whatever.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that's, there's this aha moment where, in my head, maybe not on paper yet, but in my head, I make that connection. I connect those dots, and that's my favorite part of the writing process, when I can see how this is all going to play out, and then I get to make it happen.
Right.
There's something very organic and spontaneous about that I love.
Right. Your first book, it took you 5 years to write it, 2 years to get your agent. So there's a lot of time wrapped up in that book. And I think you're on probably about a book a year schedule now, aren't you?
I am, yes.
Does it, going from having that leisurely time to really put everything into the book to now, getting down to work and getting the work done and getting the book out. How has your daily schedule changed? Well, your daily schedule has obviously changed a lot, but, do you write every day? Do you have a purpose for the book you're working on each and every day?
I definitely try and write every day. Some days it's a half an hour, some days it's 6 hours. So it varies widely, depending on the day and what else I have going on. I don't necessarily set myself to a daily word count, just because I know that some days will be busier, some days the words might flow easier, and some days I might be completely blocked. So I sort of look maybe at more of a monthly goal, where I want to be by the end of a month, just knowing that the days are going to fluctuate throughout the month. And it sort of takes some of the pressure off. If I'm having a bad week, I can make up for it the following week. But I think the biggest thing that changed during this whole process that really sort of sped things up for me was that writing was no longer, this hobby that I just did behind closed doors when I had a few minutes to spare. Now I was able to have a career with it. And so it was able to really take center stage in my life. And I was able to make it a priority without feeling any guilt about it. I think that previously, when it was more of a hobby, there was a sense of guilt, like I should be doing something else rather than writing, when I wasn't actually making a living doing it. But now it's my career, and I love that I can take something that I'm just so excited about and love to do and have a career with it.
Absolutely, absolutely. The new book is When the Lights Go Out. It's available everywhere when you're hearing this. It's available audiobook, Kindle, hardcover. Any way that you like to consume books, you can get a copy of it today. Mary, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today. If people are just learning about you and your work, where could they find you to maybe dig into your back catalog and to keep up with new news and all of that good stuff?
Absolutely. The best place to visit me would be on my website. It's www.marykubica.com. And I have links on there to all the previous books, to my social media. So that would be the best place to find me.
Excellent. Mary, we're really excited about the book. There's links to it in the show notes for everyone to go find. Thank you so much for coming on the show, and we wish you the utmost success with the new book.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I had a great time.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
On the Wednesday night before Thanksgiving, Joey locked the doors of the Washington Irving Chapel and checked the windows from the outside, making sure that the cemetery offices were dark. Satisfied, he donned a knit cap and trudged uphill to the employee parking lot. He'd forgotten how desolate the grounds became at night. A fog had gathered, blurring the moon and stars. His rusty Volkswagen Beetle, christened Ladybug by Jason, sat in shadow alongside his dad's white van, which bore an image of the horseman and the cemetery's web address. Joey swept a palmful of condensation from Ladybug's windshield and fumbled for his keys. He heard a laugh, high and young. He froze. "Hello?" He shook off gooseflesh and found his key. He started the engine and backed out, headlights off, praying not to knock over a headstone, again. A child stood on the hillside amongst the graves. "You okay, kid? Cemetery's closed." He turned on his headlights. The child vanished. Joey idled in the drive, frowning. What had just happened? He turned off the headlights and waited for his eyes to adjust. The silhouette reappeared. The child stood in the road now, blocking his way. He and the ghost stared at each other. He bit his tongue and squinted over the steering wheel. He couldn't resolve the ghost's features, only a tiny body in ruffles? Yes, a dress. A little girl with shoulder-length hair. The figure crouched, threw its arms over its head and skipped away. A giggle followed after. The ghost skipped up the hill, turned around, and beckoned through the fog. "Please come." Joey shook his head. "No way. Ain't gonna happen." But he felt compelled to follow. What could a little girl do to him after all? He would keep a safe distance. The gravel sounded like soft rain beneath his tires. It drew him helplessly, past weeping cypresses and mausoleums blue with moonlight. He followed the giggle, the skipping ribbons, the little body made of shadow and quicksilver. The north end of the cemetery grounds rose to a steep wooded slope. The ghost had led him to Section 77, the northernmost boundary of the cemetery, but he'd lost her. He killed the engine, summoned his courage, and climbed out. The night air brought him fully awake. "Where are you?" he whispered, scanning the graves. A row of diseased hemlock trees stood at the fence line. Joey knew them well. They were dying, infested by some parasite called, he fished for the name, woolly adelgig. His crew had cut them back many times, lopping off limbs and heads, trying to save them. The hemlocks had grown back twisted and tormented. They stood as a row of grotesque sentinels guarding the threshold of the forest. The ghost climbed the slope, spun at the fence, and sat hugging her knees. The black mass of the Rockefeller State Park Preserve loomed behind her. "What do you want?" Joey whispered. "Play." He stepped forward, hands shaking. He just wanted to see her face, the face of a real ghost. To see the curve of her cheek, the sparkle that might have been her left eye. "Come and play, Joey." He froze. The sound of his name terrified him. She pointed over his shoulder. "Play with us." He turned and realized his mistake. He'd driven with his eyes on the girl, trying not to lose her, never looking behind. They had been followed.